The Expedition of Humphry Clinker. By Tobias Smollett. To Miss Letitia Willis, at Gloucester. My dearest Letty, never did poor prisoner long for deliverance, more than I have longed for an opportunity to disperse my cares into your friendly bosom, and the occasion which now presents itself, is little less than miraculous. Honest Saunders Macaulay, the travelling Scotchman, who goes every year to Wales, is now at Glasgow, buying goods, and coming to pay his respects to our family, has undertaken to deliver this letter into your own hand. We have been 6 weeks in Scotland, and seen the principal towns of the kingdom, where we have been treated with great civility. The people are very courteous, and the country being exceedingly romantic, suits my turn and inclinations. I contracted some friendships at Edinburgh, which is a large and lofty city, full of gay company, and, in particular, commenced an intimate correspondence with one Miss R.T.N., an amiable young lady of my own age, whose charms seemed to soften, and even to subdue the stubborn heart of my brother Jery, but he no sooner left the place than he relapsed into his former insensibility. I feel, however, that this indifference is not the family constitution. I never admitted but one idea of love, and that has taken such root in my heart, as to be equally proof against all the pulls of discretion, and the frosts of neglect. Dear Letty, I had an alarming adventure at the Hunters' Ball in Edinburgh, while I sat discoursing with a friend in a corner. All at once the very image of Wilson stood before me, dressed exactly as he was in the character of Amewell. It was one Mr. Gordon, whom I had not seen before. Shocked at the sudden apparition, I fainted away, and threw the whole assembly in confusion. However, the cause of my disorder remained a secret to everybody but my brother, who was likewise struck with the resemblance, and scolded after we came home. I am very sensible of Jery's affection, and know he spoke as well with a view to my own interest and happiness, as in regard to the honor of the family, but I cannot bear to have my wounds probed severely. I was not so much affected by the censure he passed upon my own indiscretion, as with the reflection he made on the conduct of Wilson. He observed, that if he was really the gentleman he pretended to be, and harbored nothing but honorable designs, he would have vindicated his pretensions in the face of day. This remark made a deep impression upon my mind. I endeavored to conceal my thoughts, and this endeavor had a bad effect upon my health and spirits. So it was thought necessary that I should go to the Highlands, and drink the goat milk whey. We went accordingly to Loch Lomond, one of the most enchanting spots in the whole world, and what with this remedy, which I had every morning fresh from the mountains, and the pure air, and cheerful company, I have recovered my flesh and appetite, though there is something still at bottom, which it is not in the power of air, exercise, company, or medicine to remove. These incidents would not touch me so nearly, if I had a sensible confidant to sympathize with my affliction, and comfort me with wholesome advice. I have nothing of this kind, except Win Jenkins, who is really a good body in the main, but very ill qualified for such an office. The poor creature is weak in her nerves, as well as in her understanding, otherwise I might have known the true name and character of that unfortunate youth. But why do I call him unfortunate? Perhaps the epithet is more applicable to me for having listened to the false professions of, but, hold. I have as yet no right, and sure I have no inclination to believe anything to the prejudice of his honor. In that reflection I shall still exert my patience. As for Mrs. Jenkins, she herself is really an object of compassion. Between vanity, Methodism, and love, her head is almost turned. I should have more regard for her, however, if she had been more constant in the object of her affection, but, truly, she aimed at conquest, and flirted at the same time with my uncle's footman, Humphry Clinker, who is really a deserving young man, and one Dutton, my brother's valet de chambre, a debauched fellow, who, leaving Win in the lurch, ran away with another man's bride at Berwick. My dear Willis, I am truly ashamed of my own sex. We complain of advantages which the men take of our youth, inexperience, insensibility, and all that, but I have seen enough to believe that our sex in general make it their business to ensnare the other, and for this purpose, employ arts which are by no means to be justified. In point of constancy, they certainly have nothing to reproach the male part of the creation. My poor aunt, without any regard to her years and imperfections, has gone to market with her charms in every place where she thought she had the least chance to dispose of her person, which, however, hangs still heavy on her hands. I am afraid she has used even religion as a decoy, though it has not answered her expectation. She has been praying, preaching, and catechizing among the Methodists, with whom this country abounds, and pretends to have such manifestations and revelations, as even Clinker himself can hardly believe, though the poor fellow is half crazy with enthusiasm. As for Jenkins, she affects to take all her mistress's reveries for gospel. She has also her hard heavings and motions of the spirit, and God forgive me if I think uncharitably, but all this seems to me to be downright hypocrisy and deceit. Perhaps, indeed, the poor girl imposes on herself. She is generally an flutter, and is much subject to vapors. Since we came to Scotland, she has seen apparitions, and pretends to prophesy. If I could put faith in all these supernatural visitations, I should think myself abandoned of grace, for I have neither seen, heard, nor felt anything of this nature, although I endeavor to discharge the duties of religion with all the sincerity, zeal, and devotion that is in the power of, dear Letty, your ever affectionate, Lydia Melford. Glasgow, September 7. We are so far on our return to Brambleton Hall, and I would fain hope we shall take Gloucester in our way, in which case I shall have the inexpressible pleasure of embracing my dear Willis. Pray remember me to my worth. To Mrs. Mary Jones, at Brambleton Hall. Dear Mary, Saunders Macaulay, the Scotchman, who pushes directly for Wales, has promised to give it you into your own hand, and therefore I would not miss the opportunity to let you know, as I am still in the land of the living, and yet I have been on the brink of the other world since I sent you my last letter. We went by sea to another kingdom called Fife, and, coming back, had like to have gone to pot in a storm. What between the fright and sickness, I thought I should have brought my heart up. Even Mr. Clinker was not his own man for 48 hours after we got ashore. It was well for some folks that we 'scaped drowning, for mistress was very fractious, and seemed but indifferently prepared for a change, but, thank God, she was soon put in a better frame by the private exaltations of the Reverend Mr. Macrocodile. We afterwards turned to Starling and Glasgow, which are a couple of handsome towns, and then we went to a gentleman's house at Lochflaming, which is a wonderful sea of fresh water, with a power of highlands in the midst on't, they say as how it has no bottom, and was made by a musician, and, truly, I believe it, for it is not in the course of nature. It has got waves without wind, fish without fins, and a floating highland, and one of them is a crotchyard, where the dead are buried, and always before the person dies, a bell rings of itself to give warning. Oh Mary! This is the land of commemoration. The bell knolled when we were there. I saw lights, and heard lamentations. The gentleman, our landlord, has got another house, which he was faint to quit, on account of a mischievous ghost, that would not suffer people to lie in their beds. The fairies dwell in a hole of Carman, a mounting hard by, and they steal away the good women that are in the straw, if so be as how there ain't a horseshoe nailed to the door. And I was shown an old witch, called Elspeth Ringavy, with a red petticoat, bleared eyes, and a mould of grey bristles on her sin. That she might do me no harm, I crossed her hand with a taster, and bid her tell my fortune, and she told me such things describing Mr. Clinker to a hair, but it shall ne'er be said, that I mentioned a word of the matter. As I was troubled with fits, she advised me to bathe in the lough, which was holy water, and so I went in the morning to a private place along with the housemaid, and we bathed in our birthday soot, after the fashion of the country, and behold, whilst we dabbled in the lough, Sir George Coon started up with a gun, but we clapped our hands to our faces, and passed by him to the place where we had left our smocks. A civil gentleman would have turned his head another way, My comfort is, he knew not which was which, and, as the saying is, all cats in the dark are grey. Whilst we stayed at Lochflaming, he and our 2 squires went 3 or 4 days churning among the wild men of the mountings, a parcel of selvages that lie in caves among the rocks, devour young children, speak Welsh, but the words are different. Our ladies would not part with Mr. Clinker, because he is so stout and so pious, that he fears neither man nor devils, if so be as they don't take him by surprise. Indeed, he was once so flurried by an apparition, that he had like to have sounded. He made believe as if it had been old Admiral, but the old Admiral could not have made his hair to stand on end, and his teeth to shatter, but he said so in prudence, that the ladies mought not be afeard. Miss Liddy has been puny, and like to go into a decline. I doubt her poor art is too tender, but the Gots fay has set her on her legs again. You know's Gots fay is mother's milk to a Welsh woman. As for mistress, blessed be God, she ails nothing. Her stomach is good, and she improves in grease and godliness, but, for all that, she may have infections like other people, and I believe, she wouldn't be sorry to be called your ladyship, whenever Sir George thinks proper to ask the question, but, for my part, whatever I may see or hear, not a pratical shall ever pass the lips of, dear Molly, your loving friend, Win. Jenkins, Glasgow, September 7. Remember me, as usual, to Saul. We are now coming home, though not the nearest road. I do suppose, I shall find the kitten a fine boar at my To Sir Watkin Phillips, Bart. At Oxon. Dear Knight, once more I tread upon English ground, which I like not the worse for the 6 weeks' ramble I have made among the woods and mountains of Caledonia. No offence to the land of cakes, where bannocks grow upon straw. I never saw my uncle in such health and spirits as he now enjoys. Liddy is perfectly recovered, and Mrs. Tabitha has no reason to complain. Nevertheless, I believe, she was, till yesterday, inclined to give the whole Scotch nation to the devil, as a pack of insensible brutes, upon whom her accomplishments had been displayed in vain. At every place where we halted, did she mount the stage, and flourished her rusty arms, without being able to make one conquest. One of her last essays was against the heart of Sir George, Colquhoun, with whom she fought all the weapons more than twice over. She was grave and gay by turns, she moralized and methodized, she laughed, and romped, and danced, and sung, and sighed, and ogled, and lisped, and fluttered, and flattered, but all was preaching to the desart. The baronet, being a well-bred man, carried his civilities as far as she could in conscience expect, and, if evil tongues are to be believed, some degrees farther, but he was too much a veteran in gallantry, as well as in war, to fall into any ambuscade that she could lay for his affection. While we were absent in the Highlands, she practised also upon the Laird of Ladrishmore, and even gave him the rendezvous in the wood of Drumscalloch, but the Laird had such a reverend care of his own reputation, that he came, attended with a parson of the parish, and nothing passed but spiritual communication. After all these miscarriages, our aunt suddenly recollected Lieutenant Lismahago, whom, ever since our first arrival at Edinburgh, she seemed to have utterly forgot, but now she expressed her hopes of seeing him at Dumfries, according to his promise. We set out from Glasgow by the way of Lanark, the county town of Clydesdale, in the neighbourhood of which, the whole river Clyde, rushing down a steep rock, forms a very noble and stupendous cascade. Next day we were obliged to halt in a small borough, until the carriage, which had received some damage, should be repaired, and here we met with an incident which warmly interested the benevolent spirit of Mr. Bramble. As we stood at the window of an inn that fronted the public prison, a person arrived on horseback, genteelly, though plainly, dressed in a blue frock, with his own hair cut short, and a gold-laced hat upon his head. Alighting, and giving his horse to the landlord, he advanced to an old man who was at work in paving the street, and accosted him in these words: "This is hard work for such an old man as you." So saying, he took the instrument out of his hand, and began to thump the pavement. After a few strokes, "Have you never a son," said he, "to ease you of this labor?" "Yes, and please your honor," replied the senior, "I have 3 hopeful lads, but, at present, they are out of the way." "Honor not me," cried the stranger, "but more becomes me to honor your grey hairs. Where are those sons you talk of?" The ancient paviour said, his eldest son was a captain in the East Indies, and the youngest had lately enlisted as a soldier, in hopes of prospering like his brother. The gentleman desiring to know what was become of the second, he wiped his eyes, and owned, he had taken upon him his old father's debts, for which he was now in the prison hard by. The traveller made 3 quick steps towards the jail, then turning short, "Tell me," said he, "has that unnatural captain sent you nothing to relieve your distress?" "Call him not unnatural," replied the other, "God's blessing be upon him. He sent me a great deal of money, but I made a bad use of it. I lost it by being security for a gentleman that was my landlord, and was stripped of all I had in the world besides." At that instant a young man, thrusting out his head and neck, between 2 iron bars in the prison window, exclaimed, "Father! Father! If my brother William is in life, that's he." "I am!" "I am!" cried the stranger, clasping the old man in his arms, and shedding a flood of tears. "I am your son Willie, sure enough." Before the father, who was quite confounded, could make any return to this tenderness, a decent old woman bolting out from the door of a poor habitation, cried, "Where is my bairn? Where is my dear Willie?" The captain no sooner beheld her, than he quitted his father, and ran into her embrace. I can assure you, my uncle, who saw and heard everything that passed, was as much moved as any one of the parties concerned in this pathetic recognition. He sobbed, and wept, and clapped his hands, and hollowed, and finally ran down into the street. By this time, the captain had retired with his parents, and all the inhabitants of the place were assembled at the door. Mr. Bramble, nevertheless, pressed through the crowd, and entering the house, "Captain," said he, "I beg the favor of your acquaintance. I would have traveled 100 miles to see this affecting scene, and I shall think myself happy if you and your parents will dine with me at the public house." The captain thanked him for his kind invitation, which, he said, he would accept with pleasure, but in the meantime, he could not think of eating or drinking, while his poor brother was in trouble. He forthwith deposited a sum equal to the debt in the hands of the magistrate, who ventured to set his brother at liberty without farther process, and then the whole family repaired to the inn with my uncle, attended by the crowd, the individuals of which shook their townsman by the hand, while he returned their caresses without the least sign of pride or affectation. This honest favorite of fortune, whose name was Brown, told my uncle, that he had been bred a weaver, and, about 18 years ago, had, from a spirit of idleness and dissipation, enlisted as a soldier in the service of the East India Company, that, in the course of duty, he had the good fortune to attract the notice and approbation of Lord Clive, who preferred him from one step to another, till he attained the rank of captain and paymaster to the regiment, in which capacities he had honestly amassed above £12,000, and, at the peace, resigned his commission. He had sent several remittances to his father, who received the first only, consisting of £100, the second had fallen into the hands of a bankrupt, and the third had been consigned to a gentleman of Scotland, who died before it arrived, so that it still remained to be accounted for by his executors. He now presented the old man with £50 for his present occasions, over and above bank notes for 100, which he had deposited for his brother's release. He brought along with him a deed ready executed, by which he settled a perpetuity of £80 upon his parents, to be inherited by their other 2 sons after their decease. He promised to purchase a commission for his youngest brother, to take the other as his own partner in a manufacture which he intended to set up, to give employment and bread to the industrious, and to give £500, by way of dower, to his sister, who had married a farmer in low circumstances. Finally, He gave £50 to the poor of the town where he was born, and feasted all the inhabitants without exception. My uncle was so charmed with the character of Captain Brown, that he drank his health 3 times successively at dinner. He said, he was proud of his acquaintance, that he was an honor to his country, and had in some measure redeemed human nature from the reproach of pride, selfishness, and ingratitude. For my part, I was as much pleased with the modesty as with the filial virtue of this honest soldier, who assumed no merit from his success, and said very little of his own transactions, though the answers he made to our inquiries were equally sensible and laconic. Mrs. Tabitha behaved very graciously to him until she understood that he was going to make a tender of his hand to a person of low estate, who had been his sweetheart while he worked as a journeyman weaver. Our aunt was no sooner made acquainted with this design, than she starched up her behavior with a double proportion of reserve, and, when the company broke up, she observed with a toss of her nose, that Brown was a civil fellow enough, considering the lowness of his original, but that fortune, though she had mended his circumstances, was incapable to raise his ideas, which were still humble and plebeian. On the day that succeeded this adventure, we went some miles out of our road to see Drumland Rig, a seat belonging to the Duke of Queensberry, which appears like a magnificent palace erected by magic, in the midst of a wilderness. It is indeed a princely mansion, with suitable parks and plantations, rendered still more striking by the nakedness of the surrounding country, which is one of the wildest tracts in all Scotland. This wildness, however, is different from that of the Highlands, for here the mountains, instead of heath, are covered with a fine green sward, affording pasture to innumerable flocks of sheep. But the fleeces of this country, called Nithsdale, are not comparable to the wool of Galloway, which is said to equal that of Salisbury Plain. Having passed the night at the castle of Drumland Rig, by invitation from the Duke himself, who is one of the best men that ever breathed, we prosecuted our journey to Dumfries, a very elegant trading town near the borders of England, where we found plenty of good provision and excellent wine, at very reasonable prices, and the accommodation as good in all respects as in any part of South Britain. If I was confined to Scotland for life, I would choose Dumfries as the place of my residence. Here we made inquiries about Captain Lismahago, of whom hearing no tidings, we proceeded by the Solway Frith, to Carlisle. You must know, that the Solway sands, upon which travellers pass at low water, are exceedingly dangerous, because, as the tide makes, they become quick in different places, and the flood rushes in so impetuously, that the passengers are often overtaken by the sea and perish. In crossing these treacherous searts with a guide, we perceived a drowned horse, which Humphry Clinker, after due inspection, declared to be the very identical beast which Mr. Lismahago rode when he parted with us at Felton Bridge in Northumberland. This information, which seemed to intimate that our friend the lieutenant had shared the fate of his horse, affected us all, and above all our aunt, Tabitha, who shed salt tears, and obliged Clinker to pull a few hairs out of the dead horse's tail, to be worn in a ring as a remembrance of his master. But her grief and ours was not of long duration, for one of the first persons we saw in Carlisle, was the lieutenant in propria persona, bargaining with a horse dealer for another steed, in the yard of the inn where we alighted. Mrs. Bramble was the first that perceived him, and screamed as if she had seen a ghost, and, truly, at a proper time and place, he might very well have passed for an inhabitant of another world, for he was more meagre and grim than before. We received him the more cordially for having supposed he had been drowned, and he was not deficient in expressions of satisfaction at this meeting. He told us, he had inquired for us at Dumfries, and been informed by a travelling merchant from Glasgow, that we had resolved to return by the way of Coldstream. He said, that in passing the sands without a guide, his horse had knocked up, and he himself must have perished, if he had not been providentially relieved by a return post-chaise. He moreover gave us to understand, that his scheme of settling in his own country, having miscarried, he was so far on his way to London, with a view to embark for North America, where he intended to pass the rest of his days among his old friends the Miamis, and amuse himself in finishing the education of the son he had by his beloved Squincanacusta. This project was by no means agreeable to our good aunt, who expatiated upon the fatigues and dangers that would attend such a long voyage by sea, and afterwards such a tedious journey by land. She enlarged particularly on the risk he would run, with respect to the concerns of his precious soul, among savages who had not yet received the glad tidings of salvation, and she hinted that his abandoning Great Britain might, perhaps, prove fatal to the inclinations of some deserving person, whom he was qualified to make happy, for life. My uncle, who is really a Don Quixote in generosity, understanding that Lismahago's real reason for leaving Scotland was the impossibility of subsisting in it with any decency upon the wretched provision of a subaltern's half-pay, began to be warmly interested on the side of compassion. He thought it very hard, that a gentleman who had served his country with honor, should be driven by necessity to spend his old age, among the refuse of mankind, in such a remote part of the world. He discoursed with me upon the subject, observing, that he would willingly offer the lieutenant an asylum at Brambleton Hall, if he did not foresee that his singularities and humour of contradiction would render him an intolerable housemate, though his conversation at some times might be both instructive and entertaining. But, as there seemed to be something particular in his attention to Mrs. Tabitha, he and I agreed in opinion, that this intercourse should be encouraged and improved, if possible, into a matrimonial union, in which case there would be a comfortable provision for both, and they might be settled in a house of their own, so that Mr. Bramble should have no more of their company than he desired. In pursuance of this design, Lismahago has been invited to pass the winter at Brambleton Hall, as it will be time enough to execute his American project in the spring. He has taken time to consider of this proposal. Meanwhile, he will keep us company as far as we travel in the road to Bristol, where he has hopes of getting a passage for America. I make no doubt but that he will postpone his voyage, and prosecute his addresses to a happy consummation, and sure, if it produces any fruit, it must be of a very peculiar flavour. As the weather continues favourable, I believe, we shall take the Peak of Derbyshire and Buxton Wells in our way. At any rate, from the first place where we make any stay, you shall hear again from yours always, J. Melford. Carlisle. To Dr. Lewis. Dear Doctor, the peasantry of Scotland are certainly on a poor footing all over the kingdom, and yet they look better, and are better clothed than those of the same rank in Burgundy, and many other places of France and Italy. Nay, I will venture to say they are better fed, notwithstanding the boasted wine of these foreign countries. The country people of North Britain live chiefly on oatmeal, and milk, cheese, butter, and some garden stuff, with now and then a pickled ring, by way of delicacy, but flesh meat they seldom or never taste, nor any kind of strong liquor, except twopenny, at times of uncommon festivity. Their breakfast is a kind of hasty pudding, of oatmeal or pease meal, eaten with milk. They have commonly pottage for dinner, composed of kale or cole, leeks, barley or big, and butter, and this is reinforced with bread and cheese, made of skimmed milk. At night they sup on sowens or flummery of oatmeal. In a scarcity of oats, they use the meal of barley and peas, which is both nourishing and palatable. Some of them have potatoes, and you find parsnips in every peasant's garden. They are clothed with a coarse kind of russet of their own making, which is both decent and warm. They dwell in poor huts, built of loose stones and turf, without any mortar, having a fireplace or hearth in the middle, generally made of an old millstone, and a hole at top to let out the smoke. These people, however, are content, and wonderfully sagacious. All of them read the Bible, and are even qualified to dispute upon the articles of their faith, which in those parts, I have seen, is entirely Presbyterian. I am told that the inhabitants of Aberdeenshire are still more acute. I once knew a Scotch gentleman at London, who had declared war against this part of his countrymen, and swore that the impudence and knavery of the Scots, in that quarter, had brought a reproach upon the whole nation. The River Clyde, above Glasgow, is quite pastoral, and the banks of it are everywhere adorned with fine villas. From the sea to its source, we may reckon the seats of many families of the first rank, such as the Duke of Argyll at Roseneath, the Earl of Bute in the Isle of that name, the Earl of Glencairn at Finleston, Lord Blantyre at Eraskin, the Duchess of Douglas at Bothwell, Duke Hamilton at Hamilton, the Duke of Douglas at Douglas, and the Earl of Hindford at Carmichael. Hamilton is a noble palace, magnificently furnished, and hard by is the village of that name, one of the neatest little towns I have seen in any country. The old castle of Douglas being burned to the ground by accident, the late Duke resolved, as head of the first family of Scotland, to have the largest house in the kingdom, and ordered a plan for this purpose, but there was only one wing of it finished when he died. It is to be hoped that his nephew, who is now in possession of his great fortune, will complete the design of his predecessor. Clydesdale is in general populous and rich, containing a great number of gentlemen, who are independent in their fortune, but it produces more cattle than corn. This is also the case with Tweedale, through part of which we passed, and Nithsdale, which is generally rough, wild, and mountainous. These hills are covered with sheep, and this is the small delicious mutton, so much preferable to that of the London market. As their feeding costs so little, the sheep are not killed till 5 years old, when their flesh, juices, and flavor are in perfection, but their fleeces are much damaged by the tar, with which they are smeared to preserve them from the rot in winter, during which they run wild night and day, and thousands are lost under huge wreaths of snow. 'Tis pity the farmers cannot contrive some means to shelter this useful animal from the inclemencies of a rigorous climate, especially from the perpetual rains, which are more prejudicial than the greatest extremity of cold weather. On the little River Nid is situated the castle of Drumlanrig, one of the noblest seats in Great Britain, belonging to the Duke of Queensberry, one of those few noblemen whose goodness of heart does honor to human nature. I shall not pretend to enter into a description of this palace, which is really an instance of the sublime in magnificence, as well as in situation, and puts one in mind of the beautiful city of Palmyra, rising like a vision in the midst of the wilderness. His Grace keeps open house, and lives with great splendor. He did us the honor to receive us with great courtesy, and detained us all night, together with above 20 other guests, with all their servants and horses to a very considerable number. The Duchess was equally gracious, and took our ladies under her immediate protection. The longer I live, I see more reason to believe that prejudices of education are never wholly eradicated, even when they are discovered to be erroneous and absurd. Such habits of thinking as interest the grand passions, cleave to the human heart in such a manner, that though an effort of reason may force them from their hold for a moment, this violence no sooner ceases, than they resume their grasp with an increased elasticity and adhesion. I am led into this reflection, by what passed at the Duke's table after supper. The conversation turned upon the vulgar notions of spirits and omens, that prevail among the commonalty of North Britain, and all the company agreed, that nothing could be more ridiculous. One gentleman, however, told a remarkable story of himself, by way of speculation. Being on a party of hunting in the north, said he, I resolved to visit an old friend, whom I had not seen for 20 years, so long he had been retired and sequestered from all his acquaintance, and lived in a moping melancholy way, much afflicted with lowness of spirits, occasioned by the death of his wife, whom he had loved with uncommon affection. As he resided in a remote part of the country, and we were 5 gentlemen with as many servants, we carried some provision with us from the next market town, lest we should find him unprepared for our reception. The roads being bad, we did not arrive at the house till 2 o'clock in the afternoon, and were agreeably surprised to find a very good dinner ready in the kitchen, and the cloth laid with 6 covers. My friend himself appeared in his best apparel at the gate, and received us with open arms, telling me he had been expecting us these 2 hours. Astonished at this declaration, I asked who had given him intelligence of our coming? And he smiled without making any other reply. However, presuming upon our former intimacy, I afterwards insisted upon knowing, and he told me, very gravely, he had seen me in a vision of the second sight, nay, he called in the evidence of his steward, who solemnly declared that his master had the day before apprised him of my coming, with 4 other strangers, and ordered him to provide accordingly, in consequence of which intimation, he had prepared the dinner which we were now eating, and laid the covers according to the number foretold. The incident we all own to be remarkable, and I endeavored to account for it by natural means. I observed that as the gentleman was of a visionary turn, the casual idea, or remembrance of his old friend, might suggest those circumstances, which accident had for once realized, but that in all probability he had seen many visions of the same kind, which were never verified. None of the company directly dissented from my opinion, but from the objections that were hinted, I could plainly perceive that the majority were persuaded there was something more extraordinary in the case. Another gentleman of the company, addressing himself to me, without all doubt, said he, a diseased imagination is very apt to produce visions, but we must find some other method to account for something of this kind, that happened within these 8 days in my neighborhood. A gentleman of a good family, who cannot be deemed a visionary in any sense of the word, was near his own gate, in the twilight, visited by his grandfather, who has been dead these 15 years. The spectre was mounted seemingly on the very horse he used to ride, with an angry and terrible countenance, and said something, which his grandson, in the confusion of fear, could not understand. But this was not all. He lifted up a huge horsewhip, and applied it with great violence to his back and shoulders, on which I saw the impression with my own eyes. The apparition was afterwards seen by the sexton of the parish, hovering about the tomb where his body lies interred, as the man declared to several persons in the village, before he knew what had happened to the gentleman. Nay, he actually came to me as a justice of the peace, in order to make oath of these particulars, which, however, I declined administering. As for the grandson of the defunct, he is a sober, sensible, worldly-minded fellow, too intent upon schemes of interest to give in to reveries. He would have willingly concealed the affair, but he bawled out in the first transport of his fear, and, running into the house, exposed his back and his sconce to the whole family, so that there was no denying it in the sequel. It is now the common discourse of the country, that this appearance and behavior of the old man's spirit portends some great calamity to the family, and the good woman has actually taken to her bed in this apprehension. Though I did not pretend to explain this mystery, I said, I did not at all doubt, but it would one day appear to be a deception, and, in all probability, a scheme executed by some enemy of the person who had sustained the assault. But still the gentleman insisted upon the clearness of the evidence, and the concurrence of testimony, by which 2 creditable witnesses, without any communication one with another, affirmed the appearance of the same man, with whose person they were both well acquainted. From Drumlanrig we pursued the course of the Nid to Dumfries, which stands 7 miles above the place where the river falls into the sea, and is, after Glasgow, the handsomest town I have seen in Scotland. The inhabitants, indeed, seem to have proposed that city as their model, not only in beautifying their town and regulating its police, but also in prosecuting their schemes of commerce and manufacture, by which they are grown rich and opulent. We re-entered England, by the way of Carlisle, where we accidentally met with our friend Lismahago, whom we had in vain inquired after at Dumfries and other places. It would seem that the captain, like the prophets of old, is but little honored in his own country, which he has now renounced forever. He gave me the following particulars of his visit to his native soil. In his way to the place of his nativity, he learned that his nephew had married the daughter of a burgos, who directed a weaving manufacture, and had gone into partnership with his father-in-law. Chagrined with this information, he had arrived at the gate in the twilight, where he heard the sound of treadles in the great hall, which had exasperated him to such a degree, that he had like to have lost his senses. While he was thus transported with indignation, his nephew chanced to come forth, when, being no longer master of his passion, he cried, "Degenerate rascal! You have made my father's house a den of thieves," and at the same time chastised him with his horsewhip. Then, riding round the adjoining village, he had visited the burying ground of his ancestors by moonlight, and, having paid his respects to their manes, travelled all night to another part of the country, finding the head of the family in such a disgraceful situation, all his own friends dead or removed from the places of their former residence, and the expense of living increased to double of what it had been when he first left his native country. He had bid it an eternal adieu, and was determined to seek for repose among the forests of America. I was no longer at a loss to account for the apparition, which had been described at Drumland Rig, and when I repeated the story to the lieutenant, he was much pleased to think his resentment had been so much more effectual than he intended, and he owned he might at such an hour, and in such an equipage, very well pass for the ghost of his father, whom he was said greatly to resemble. Between friends, I fancy Lismahago will find a retreat without going so far as the wigwams of the Miamis. My sister Tabby is making continual advances to him, in the way of affection, and, if I may trust to appearances, the captain is disposed to take opportunity by the forelock. For my part, I intend to encourage this correspondence, and shall be glad to see them united. In that case, we shall find a way to settle them comfortably in our own neighborhood. I, and my servants, will get rid of a very troublesome and tyrannic gouvernante, and I shall have the benefit of Lismahago's conversation, without being obliged to take more of his company than I desire, for though unla is a high-flavored dish, I could not bear to dine upon it every day of my life. I am much pleased with Manchester, which is one of the most agreeable and flourishing towns in Great Britain, and I perceive that this is the place which hath animated the spirit, and suggested the chief manufactures of Glasgow. We propose to visit Chatsworth, the Peak, and Buxton, from which last place we shall proceed directly homewards, though by easy journeys. If the season has been as favourable in Wales as in the north, your harvest is happily finished, and we have nothing left to think of but our October, of which let Barnes be properly reminded. You will find me much better in flesh than I was at our parting, and this short separation has given a new edge to those sentiments of friendship with which I always have been, and ever shall be, yours, Matt. Bramble, Manchester. To Mrs. Gwyllim, housekeeper at Brambleton Hall. Mrs. Gwyllim, it has pleased Providence to bring us safe back to England, and partake us in many pearls by land and water, in particular the Devil's Harsepike, and Hoyden's Hole, which hath got no bottom, and, as we are drawing onwards, it may be proper to apprise you, that Brambleton Hall may be in condition to receive us, after this long journey, to the islands of Scotland. By the 1st of next month you may begin to make constant fires in my brother's chamber and mine, and burn a faggot every day in the yellow damask room, have the tester and curtains dusted, and the feather bed and matrosses well haired, because, perhaps, with the blessing of heaven, they may be used on some occasion. Let the hogsheads be well skewered and seasoned, for Bear, as mad is resolved to have his cellar choke full. If the house was mine, I would turn over a new leaf. I don't see why the servants of Wales shouldn't drink fair water, and eat hot cakes and barley ale, as they do in Scotland, without troubling the botcher above once a quarter. I hope you keep account of Roger's proceeding in reverence to the buttermilk. I expect my due when I come home. Without baiting an ass, I'll assure you as you must have laid a great many more eggs than would be eaten, I do suppose there is a power of Turks, chickings, and guzzling about the house, and a brave cargo of cheese ready for market, and that the owl has been sent to Crickhole, saving what the maid spun in the family. Pray let the whole house and furniture have a thorough cleaning from top to bottom, for the honour of Wales, and let Roger search into, and make a general clearance of the slit holes, which the maids have in secret, for I know they are much given to sloth and uncleanness. I hope you have worked a reformation among them, as I exhorted you in my last, and set their hearts upon better things than they can find in junketing and caterwauling with the fellows of the country. As for Win Jenkins, she has undergone a perfect metamorphosis, and is become a new creature from the ammunition of Humphry Clinker, our new footman, a pious young man, who has laboured exceedingly, that she may bring forth fruits of repentance. I make no doubt but he will take the same pains with that bird hussy Mary Jones, and all of you, and that he may have power given to penetrate and instill his goodness, even into your most inward parts, is the fervent prayer of your friend in the spirit, Tab. Bramble Sceptre. 18.